Hello, gamers! If you've searched for Commander deck building advice before, you've probably heard your fair share about staples, deck building fundamentals, land count, and mana base, or things like cube theory. You probably see people telling you to run more lands, or run more interaction, or a myriad of other different pieces of advice regarding how much of X you should have in your deck. And while you can get some pretty helpful general advice, there are a lot of different opinions out there that don't necessarily align. The primary reason for that is simple but relatively unsatisfying, and the answer is that each deck is different, therefore each deck has different needs based on both the game plan and the commander. Generalized advice is all well and good, but it's never going to be perfect. However, there is a place we can look to if we want to get what are probably the strongest and most efficient generalized deck building ratios that we possibly can. And that place is CEDH. So, what I have here is a list of card ratios including mana production, card advantage, and interaction, all averaged from recent competitive data. If you checked out my last video, you'll know that I've done some data compilation using a large amount of competitive commander decks to get average play rates for a lot of the cards that you see in CEDH. If you want a more in-depth rundown on the data, you can go take a look at it, but to be brief, the data we're using today comes from a compilation of the decks that placed within the top 32 of the largest CEDH tournaments throughout the entire year of 2024, which amounted to 423 decks. So, for these ratios, we have a sample size of roughly 42,300 cards, though there's a lot of overlap in those cards, obviously. So, to figure out what the average deck ratios are exactly, there's two things we want to do. First, figure out what every card in each deck does, of course, and tag them accordingly. I could use Architect for this, but in my past experience, I've seen some questionably tagged cards on that site, as well as just tags that have kind of been left off of other cards that seemed obvious to me, so I wasn't willing to leave it up to their tagging system. So for my own satisfaction, I decided to just tag everything manually on Moxfield, which meant manually reading and tagging over 1,800 individual cards, which is a lot. It's so many cards, in fact, that we can say that's the reason I didn't get this video out sooner. Unfortunately, with that many cards, there is always the possibility for human error, and I may have mistagged a couple cards along the way, but I did make sure to double check each card, so ideally we've mitigated the possibility of data skew here. Thankfully, with the sample size of 42,000 cards, it's a lot harder to mess with the data even if I was rushing it. The second thing that we need to do, once we know what every card does, is group them together by function and then count the totals. Lastly, we divide whatever total we get by the number of decks sampled, and that becomes the average percentage of that category for each deck. So, now that we know how to do the math, let's get to the real important stuff. What ratios do CEDH decks have on average for their fundamental deck building categories? For fundamentals, I've decided to focus down on a few broad categories, more specifically, mana, card advantage, and interaction. There are a lot of specific mechanics and ability types that modify these categories, but for fundamentals, these are the things that every deck is going to need. Win conditions are another fundamental for deck building, but they're not really something that's as easy to categorize on an individual card level, since there are a lot of different ways to win the game, and a lightning bolt that's being used to burn you to death in one deck is purely a removal piece for another deck. But anyways, for the primary categories here, I've split things up slightly, and the ratios are as follows. For mana production, our average amount totals 41.43% of a deck, and for mana acceleration, the average count totals 23.91% of a deck. For card advantage, the average totals 8.34% of a deck, and for card selection, the average totals 22.38% of a deck. And finally, for interaction, the average amount totals 30.49% of a deck. Now, those of you that are good at math might have already noticed that these percentages go above 100%. More specifically, they add up to 126.55%. And that's before we even leave any deck building space for win conditions. Before we get to that, though, let's first go over the specifics of each category, and then we can talk about why the math doesn't quite add up, and how you can cheat it in various ways to make it add up. So, let's start with mana. Our flat count here for mana production was 41.43%, and this category includes every card that can produce mana in some way. So this includes lands, rituals, rocks, dorks, cards that make treasure. As long as the card produces mana, it fits in here. This does not, however, include land ramp spells or cost reduction, since all those are doing is pulling lands from your deck and reducing the costs that you already have to pay, respectively. So if you don't have any cards in your deck to make the mana in the first place, these other cards won't work. And that's part of the reason as to why mana production and mana acceleration are two different categories here. We define mana acceleration as any spell that increases the amount of mana you have either immediately or for subsequent turns. So under this definition, ramp includes actual ramp spells like rampant growth, as well as rocks and dorks like Arcane Signet or Birds of Paradise. I don't include most treasure cards though, since treasure is one-time use and the cards often cost more mana than they make in treasure. So they're closer to storing mana for later turns as opposed to getting you more mana overall. We do, however, include cost reduction, like I mentioned earlier, which is any cards that either reduce the cost of spells you cast or abilities you activate, or just cards that let you cast spells entirely for free. We also have rituals, which are one-time use spells that grant you more mana than what you spent to cast the spell. And lastly, there's untap effects, which are cards that untap lands or other permanents, so that you can use them again, usually for more mana, though they're flexible enough that you can use them for other tap effects as well. So, for all these subcategories of mana acceleration, the numbers are as follows. For ramp, the amount totals to 14.47% of a deck. For cost reduction, it's a surprising 0.81%, a reduction seemingly not as popular in competitive play. For rituals, however, we get 6.52% of a deck, which is much higher. And finally, for untap effects, it amounts to 2.11% of a deck, likely owing to the versatility and strong synergies. And therefore, if we add these four together, we get that 23.91% count for mana acceleration that we saw earlier. There is one slight problem with doing things this way though. It technically doesn't account for overlap. So for instance, if we have a mana rock that also untaps other permanents, then it counts for both categories, which is part of why our percentages here are slightly above what they should be. But we'll talk more about that later. For our next category here, we have card advantage and card selection. Card advantage is pretty simple. It's any spells or effects that give you access to more new cards than what you spent for the effect. Most basic card draw effects like Rhystic Study or Harmonize fall under this category, though so do impulse effects like Ren's Resolve, even if they don't technically draw you cards, which is why we split it up slightly. For card draw specifically, our amount totals to 7.63% of a deck, and for impulse effects like Ren's Resolve, the amount totals to 0.70%, getting us that prior total of 8.34%. It looks like we're 1% off in the rounding here, but that's because the actual full percentages for draw and impulse push the combined total up a percentage when combined and then rounded. If you want the actual full-length percentages for each category, I'll be leaving those in the description below. Moving on to card selection, we have cards that don't necessarily give you access to more cards, but nonetheless ones that filter through your deck to help you get to the important cards faster. Naturally, the most obvious example of this is tutors, and some tutors can get you more than one card, which can make them closer to card advantage, but the majority just search for one card, so we're lumping them into card selection. Then we have cantrips, or cards that let you spend one card to draw one card, usually with an added effect. Often people will say that these cards replace themselves when you play them. Similarly, fetch lands are here, since functionally they let you sacrifice them to draw and play a different land from your deck. Fetch lands also don't produce mana, so even though they're lands, they don't fall into the mana production category from earlier, showing up here instead thanks to their function. Similarly, any cycling or land cycling effects are included with the cantrips, since you're discarding one card to get one new card. Then we have looting effects, sometimes called rummaging, depending on whether you discard first or not. These cards actively put you down a card, since you have to cast the card then discard a card for each subsequent card you draw with its effect, but despite being card disadvantage, these effects are still quite useful card selection. And of course, they're quite synergistic with Graveyard strategies. Lastly, we have top deck effects, which is a bit of a broad category, but includes any effect that lets you scry or surveil, effects that let you cast spells or play lands from the top of your library, and any other effects that modify the top of your deck. While some of these are technically card advantage, most of them are closer to card selection. There are a couple other effects that can be considered card selection, such as Mill, but since they require external synergies, I decided not to include them. Looking back at the percentages for each of these, tutors total to an average amount of 10.59% of a deck, cantrips total to 1.87% of a deck, fetches total to 7.76% of a deck, looting totals to 0.49% of a deck, and top deck effects total to 1.66% of a deck. And for this category, I will stress again, these are the numbers for CEDH. This format is very fast, and when you only need 2 cards to win the game, getting those 2 cards quickly is a lot more important than filling your hand with lots of cards to have different options or multiples of certain effects. But in a casual game, you probably shouldn't be running this many tutors, especially if your game plan is more incremental, and you might instead want more card advantage engines. So you can kind of lump these categories together for more casual deck building purposes, which gives you an actual total of 30.71% for both card advantage and card selection combined. Moving on to our last category here, we have interaction. This category includes any effects that interact with opponent game plans or abilities. And if that sounds very broad, it's because it is. Removal is the most obvious type of interaction, and there are a lot of different kinds of removal. Destroy and exile effects, damage effects, be they small or large, bounce effects, polymorphs, stuff like Frogify, anything that removes an opponent's game piece. Usually people distinguish between spot removal and board wipes, but we can group them together here. As a rule though, generally you'll want to run more spot removal than board wipes, unless you have a synergy reason for running 10 Wraths, I guess. Similarly, I consider counterspells to be removal, since you're still dealing with an opponent's game piece, it's just being dealt with on the stack as opposed to on the field. Lots of removal can functionally double as protection, especially counterspells, and that flexibility is what makes it by far the most important type of interaction. The next subcategory is protection spells, though for the sake of tagging I excluded things like counterspells since I think they fit better in the last category. As for what I do actually have tagged as protection though, this is where you get effects like Fogs, cards that protect your board with hexproof or indestructible, effects that make your spells uncounterable, cards like Angel's Grace or Platinum Angel that directly prevent you from losing the game, and of course cards with the literal protection mechanic. I also include effects that let you bounce your own permanents to hand at instant speed, since those can allow you to dodge removal. And similarly, both instant speed blinks or phase-out effects can be used in this way as well. Next, we have redirect effects, which are essentially a hybrid of protection and removal. They're unique enough effects that I wanted them to have their own category, and what they do is essentially allow you to reselect the targets for a spell. This can be used to turn an opponent's removal spell against them, working as both protection for your board and your own impromptu removal of an opposing threat. The main issue is that they're much more niche to use than either prior categories, but they are still very interesting. Beyond that, we also have stacks, classic category that prevents your opponents from playing the game to begin with. Stacks is pretty broadly defined, given it's somewhat of a colloquial word, and the definition will vary depending on who you ask, but how I've decided to define it is cards that prevent your opponents from taking game actions or cards that make taking those game actions more expensive. Some exceptions are cards like Rhystic Study, which are optional costs, and cards like Rug of Smothering, which don't technically prevent you from doing anything unless your life total is low enough. You can argue about whether these cards are real stacks or not if you would like, but for tagging purposes, I think Rhystic Study effects fall more in line with draw engines, and Rug of Smothering type effects are closer to Burn or Drain, to me, at least. But any effects that stop you from casting spells, attacking, tapping your rocks, any effects that increase costs, all of those are considered for this category. Stacks has a bit of overlap with the last category here, that being graveyard hate effects. Some grave hate effects are closer to stacks, like Soulless Jailer, where they prevent opponents from taking actions, whereas some cards like Endurance or Tormod's Crypt are more proactive, directly removing the cards from your enemy's graveyards. For the percentage on this category, I decided to just include the latter types, since the other ones are already covered in the stacks category. So, for removal, we have an average amount of 18.48% of a deck. For protection, the average amount is 5.52% of a deck. For redirects, it's 0.87% of a deck, likely owing to the niche nature. And for stacks effects, it's 4.75% of a deck. Lastly, graveyard hate averages to 0.88% of a deck, and thus you get the average interaction total of 30.49%. And again, with the amount of arguable overlap in the interaction categories especially, paying attention to the total count is probably better than focusing on the individual categories, but both will be relevant for deck building purposes. So, that's all the specific subcategories you'll want to keep in mind when thinking about your ratios, and ultimately a lot of other effects can broadly fall into these categories. Like I mentioned earlier, Mill is basically card advantage for a graveyard deck, and similarly retrieval effects like Regrowth can be powerful card selection. Reanimate effects can be used as a way to essentially cheat mana costs, and theft effects can be used to steal an opponent's creature and then subsequently remove it with a sacrifice outlet. And notably, clone and copy effects can basically be whatever you need them to be. So there's a lot of flexibility that's all going to depend on your game plan, and you'll want to keep that flexibility in mind when deck building. Now that we've gotten through all of our fundamental categories, though, I will touch on arguably the most important fundamental, your win condition. The goal of every Magic the Gathering deck should always be to win the game, even if your way of doing so will differ tremendously from deck to deck. But when deck building, your win condition should be the thing you think about first. You should always be putting in cards that are imperative to your win condition and game plan before worrying about the other basic fundamentals here. You can have all the mana production, interaction, and card advantage in the world, but if you don't have any way to convert it into a win, then your deck ultimately won't be anything more than a stage hazard. So when deck building, always start by putting in your Thoracle combo, or your various Voltron pieces, or your Overwhelms and token generators. And if you end up with too many win more cards in playtesting, you can always cut them down for more of your basic fundamentals after the fact. Of course, you don't want your deck to just be cards that push your win condition, but having a concentrated amount of the best effects that you need to succeed will often be enough. The issue is, if you're running, say, 5 to 10 cards for your win condition, you're gonna have even less space in your deck for the 126.55% total for fundamentals that we were talking about earlier. Thankfully, though, there are a couple easy ways that we can cheat that number. So, remember when I talked about how Sonic Screwdriver is kind of a problem card for our percentages, since it counts towards both untapping and ramp when you consider mana acceleration? Well, turns out there are a lot of problem cards like that. In fact, they released a whole cycle of them for Modern Horizons 3. The main reason that we have such a ridiculous percentage here is thanks to these multi-purpose cards, which are mostly modal cards. Modal cards are generally any spells that let you choose between different effects when you play them. Cards like the new cycle of Fliplands that I mentioned, as well as things like Cryptic Command, Insatiable Avarice, or Jeska's Will, for instance. Having a broader variety of potential effects, even if the rate is slightly higher than what you would pay for those effects on their own, can be very helpful in situations where that flexibility is necessary. And using lots of modal cards can help fill in lots of different fundamentals for your deck, which is something that competitive players often take advantage of. Most people already recognize modal spells, but there are a lot of cards that are functionally modal without being literally classified as such. Planeswalkers are one of the easiest examples, since they will always have multiple different effects on them. And like I mentioned earlier, bounce spells work as both protection and as temporary removal, so they can fill multiple roles in a deck. Similarly, utility lands like Otawara function as either a bounce spell or a land, and lands like War Room can both produce mana and draw you cards. Any cards that have a lot of potential for different use cases like these can help make your deck more flexible and consistent while still keeping things within that 100 card limit. All that being said, many of the best multi-purpose cards like these do tend to be quite powerful. There's a reason that Jessica's Will is considered a game changer, for instance. So ultimately, if the fundamental deck ratios for your casual deck don't live up to the competitive average of 126.55%, then that's entirely fine. Casual decks aren't going to need quite as much interaction or card selection or mana acceleration as the average competitive deck, since the sheer amount of those things is part of what makes those decks competitive. The one exception here is that since CEDH decks are so fast, their mana production count being 41.43% is more of a bare minimum for casual decks. Casual EDH is nowhere near as mana efficient as competitive, so you're almost always going to want more mana production than any given CEDH deck. So if the amount of mana production that you're running is only 41 cards, your deck either needs to be extremely low curve compared to the average EDH deck, or you need to probably run more lands or ramp. Thankfully, there is an incredible resource for knowing how many lands you should be running in any given deck, and that is the Karsten land base formulas. I won't go over them too in depth, but I will leave the links to the 2 relevant articles in the description below, as well as the formula for Commander if you just want to use that for yourself. Needless to say, it's a very mathematical way to make sure that you have relatively optimal land consistency, and it is very useful information to use alongside these ratios. And unsurprisingly, you can also kind of cheat your land counts by using modal lands and including more utility lands like I mentioned. But anyways, modal cards aren't the only way to cheat the system here. The next piece of advice is to rely on your commander and your game plan. If you're running a commander that draws you cards, you can probably afford to cut a few draw engines, since you'll always have access to one at the start of every game. Similarly, if your commander ramps or cost reduces or produces a ton of mana, then you might not need as much mana acceleration, so long as you can consistently get your commander out. If you've got a board wipe in the command zone, you might not need quite as much removal as other decks will. Again, as long as you're making sure that you can always play your commander, you don't need to worry about running quite as many fundamental effects that overlap with what your commander already does. Yuriko, for instance, makes it trivial to draw cards so long as you have enough ninjas, especially the more evasive ones, so you rarely ever need more than a few other card draw engines in the deck, since every ninja that you add to the deck is functionally putting more draw power in. Similarly, if you're building a treasure deck, you probably won't be needing as much mana acceleration, since you're already getting a ton of extra mana by just making treasures in the first place. A reanimator deck might not need quite as much mana as you'd expect from the curve, since you're ideally cheating all of the deck's top end into play with cheap reanimation effects, etc. Combine this advice together, lots of modal cards, rely on your commander, and you will see a pretty marked improvement in consistency when you go to play. That's mostly it though. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed learning about CEDH deck building ratios, and hopefully you can make use of them to help improve your decks. I find that even just balancing the ratios of my casual decks to be closer to these ratios, even if they're not, reaching the exact peaks here, makes them play a lot smoother and more consistently. Though, once again, please do remember to run more mana than CEDH players. I promise you, your casual decks probably need it a lot more. And as always, if you learned something new, please do leave a like, it helps a ton. If you want to see more stuff like this in the future, please do consider subscribing. And if you've got any questions, leave them below in the comments and I'll get to them. And while you're down there, let me know how your deck averages out compared to these ratios here. I love hearing about which deck building categories you tend to run more or less of, since it's always cool to see what people value most for which decks. Hopefully you have a lovely day, and I'll see you next time.